to be here today just to have what I hope will be a fairly informal discussion after a few presentations to let you know about some great work that's been going on. We're just going to speak in order, and we've first of all got to hear from Danny, who I won't over-introduce everybody. We'll keep it nice and informal, and if people want to stop for questions after each presentation, we can do that as well, just taking one or two as we go along. So I'll let Danny take it from here and introduce yourself a little.
Hi, I brought everybody a sticker, so if you want a sticker, you can have one for being here. Since we're in a classroom setting, and I figured you might as well just embrace that whole aesthetic.
Like getting a gold star.
That's right, and you didn't even do anything yet. You're just here. Participation medal. Everyone's a winner. All right.
I haven't got any chalk, and I haven't got a board just to throw at anybody.
But we can wrap people on the wrist with okay. Okay. Oh, is this all right?
You got it.
Super. Okay. So we're a panel on gig work and how to overcome some of the problems. I'm going to talk a little bit about, well, I'm going to talk loud enough. Am I all right? To you all in the back? Super. Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of projects that my agency works on. I'm going to talk about tech workers organizing around the world against big tech companies. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the spaces in which people are actually trying to experiment more on some of these projects and some of these networks. Yeah. My name is Danny. I do user research mainly with this group called CoLab. We're about 30 worker owners around the world. And I'm based myself in California. And I want to tell you about something I found. If you can believe it, I went to a seance in a museum. This is very, very Oakland, very Bay Area. I went to a seance in a museum a few months ago for Upton Sinclair, who's a writer. Yeah? Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle, if you remember this book about meat packing and the factory farming in Chicago. Sorry, industrial food production in Chicago. But in 1934, he ran for governor, and he had this whole, well, first of all, he wrote a science fiction book about what would happen when he won the governor position for California. This guy was really, extravagant, but he had one piece in his manifesto in his campaign called End Poverty in California, which still hasn't happened. He didn't win, but as a socialist, he was very committed to one of several things, which was that the tools we use should be totally understandable and totally repairable on our own, by our own, with your own hands. And this is in the 30s, 1930s, tools were mainly agricultural implements, right? Maybe there was some, tooling in factory and sort of, production floor and so on, but it wasn't like we're talking digital technology. And that was part of his platform. He had, I think, just a few percentage points less than the vote to win, yeah? But one thing that really spoke to people in that time, and I think today it's not much different, knowing that the tools we use as workers in whatever sort of form or whatever sort of, workplace we're in, we should know what they're doing for us, and we should be able to own them in our own right. But today, I guess this is a bit of a. I think I took this photo in 2007 or 8. So today we see that a lot of the tools that we have are not just incomprehensible, but they're being changed and removed from our hands, really without much agency or much say in the matter. So payphones being a sort of a joke in the US these days. There's not many of them. This one happened to get hit by a car, it looks like. I don't know, this is in New York. So what I want to talk about is a couple of projects that bring some imagination back into what it really looks like to own the tools as workers, and in the sort of form or the sort of situation of the work you're doing, what kind of employment or contract. Some of you saw the presentation yesterday by Maru Batista on Up and Go. So my co-op built this platform. We were the sort of partner for the technology behind it. Up and Go, for those of you who haven't seen it or heard of it, upandgo.coop. Sorry, I didn't put the URL in here. It's really not that complicated of a tool. It's a website. And what it does, the job that tool does for these workers, these cleaning professionals in New York City, is it replaces their need to go out and put flyers up, like stapling flyers around town to advertise their cleaning services. So it's like really just a website in that sense. As the tool does the job of replacing this hustle around town to do marketing. But it's more than that, obviously. It's also a cooperatively owned piece of technology. So these, I'll explain the reason that they compete and then the way that they manage it. I drew this a couple of days ago just to illustrate it. Most of the platforms out there in the world are like on the right-hand side, where somebody else builds the tool for you. It's an intermediary platform, and they take a hefty cut. I think some platforms that are providing services for home cleaning take almost, I don't know if that's actually true, maybe up to, let's say up to 40%. Maybe 50% is a little extravagant. They take 40% of the wage that you as a gig worker would get for management of the platform, and a good chunk of it goes to outside investors who saw that this thing had a lot of potential. With Up and Go, the tool is, not only is it owned by the workers themselves, but 95% of the revenue goes to the cooperatives to distribute how they choose. 5% goes to maintaining the platform. It's actually a little less than that, but there's credit card fees and other stuff. But they run the platform. They meet every month, and they make decisions about pricing. We need to make sure that people tell us whether or not they have a vacuum. They're really involved in the product design of this tool. And so they're my boss. As a person who's doing the user research, the way that this tool is built is very much directed by these women, mostly immigrants, mostly Latinx individuals in New York City. And so that's quite a different imagination. I mean, it's very matter of fact the way I've laid it out, but very few people have seen or been able to work with one of these platforms, one of these tools. So it's one of very few, we talked that the cooperative platform world, platform cooperativism is people like to say there's 272, projects worldwide. I think there's really less than a handful of gig working tools or networks like what we'll hear from otherwise. And to abstract away from this is the real imperative right now in 2018. I'll share with you one other project that we're working on, which is called Core Staffing. Core Staffing is a group of 12 formerly incarcerated men and women. Burn all the prisons. That's
I'm not going to shut the door. We're going to see what's going on.
It's the way it's done.
We're very excited.
Oh yeah, I think it will manage, unless you're going to keep applauding.
Yeah,
but,
I'm going to leave the door open.
So these men and women are out of prison, returning citizens is the preferred term, and they also are a cooperative of workers. They also do contracting with construction and landscaping, and they're not yet using anything really. They have a website, this sort of Squarespace thing. If you've ever seen Squarespace, it's just a simple template. But they also are trying to build some kind of tool to help them do better contracting and specifically better SMS coordination. So if there's going to be 7 or some people showing up to do a construction job one day, and 1 or 2 people are late, where are they? Are they there yet? Can we get a replacement? That's a pretty complicated tool, but they want to have that for themselves. They don't want to pay an outside vendor, because they need to customize it, and also it has to be appropriate for dealing with, unfortunately, in the US, there's loads of regulations around employing people with a criminal record. And as fucked up as that is, they want to own that technology at the same time so they can have it their way, make it right, and also be the beneficiaries. So working with CoLab, we're able to work across a couple of these projects and have them talk to each other. I don't see Emma here, but the more we can have some of these projects that are operating and succeeding share what they're doing and abstract away from their own case to others, the faster I think we'll see more of these real tools come out and more ownership of them in a way that actually makes them useful. So I'm gonna just point out to one thing. I'm glad I put the URL in here. The technology for both of these cases is really secondary. The tool, is just a tool, really. These co-ops are excellent. The women in Up and Go are 10-year veterans cleaning houses and apartments. They know what they're doing. They know how to work with each other. These men and women in Baltimore, they are super competent, and they're super supportive of one another. So the tool that we've built them is really secondary. And that's one of the things I love about working in this collective with these different situations is it really subordinates technology to these labor arrangements, let's call them. And I wrote something for Stir at the bequest of Johnny Gordon Farley. If you all know him, he'll maybe try to get you to write for him too one day. To talk about gig work. And more or less I laid out the argument that it's really financing and engagement around these platforms that matters. The user experience is really quite secondary, but if you're interested, you can read about that. Now, I wanted to mention also about the spaces to bring some of these projects together. Nathan was kind enough to mention this yesterday, Nathan Schneider, in his talk in the morning. Hackathons have a bad reputation, rightfully so. Often they're used as ways to bring out people in their sort of volunteer time to do some interesting problem solving, and then the benefits of that are all accruing back to whoever hosted it. Maybe they get a little experience, a little connection in the course of these events, but most hackathons are fairly, well, I mean, nowadays, 10, 15 years later after they were popular, nowadays they're very corporate anyway. But we've been doing these events to try to, in the Bay Area and in New York, and soon somewhere else in Barcelona, we've been doing these very small events to bring together co-ops and people who work in them with technologists, again, to sort of subordinate those technologists, say, look, these are cooperative ventures. They're trying to convert into a co-op, and they could use some kind of technical help, some technical assistance in a very classic way. So we've been doing these, and we've had loads of people do governance experiments. There's a project for home care workers that's trying to build their own tooling. Having some of these spaces where these groups can meet each other and where the technologists who are curious and looking for problems can kind of slot in, also has a side effect of pulling people from some of their jobs to go freelance. So I think it's a funny sort of way to kick around the theme of gig work, where some of the people who came to this event, about 80-some people, 2 or 3 of them were like, you know what? I'm going to quit my job. One of them works at Facebook, and I'm going to help work with one of these projects for 3 months. They have that privilege, but it's also a really exciting thing to see people see that being a sort of freelance or independent worker for a duration of time is something they can take advantage of. It's not obviously the precariousness, something we want to celebrate, but it has its upsides. If you're interested in the notes from that event, we have loads of notes, loads of projects that showed up. The URL for the community note document is made2uwo. This is Camille Kerr. I hope one of you all meet her someday. She's doing a home care cooperative across the state of Illinois. So I don't know how many thousands of very, very precarious workers doing home care, but she's going to build some tooling for them to get their certification and their payments smoothed out. So I'm just going to close with one other thing about the bigger context of technology in the gig work world. There's a network of tech workers called the Tech Workers Coalition. It's all volunteer, it's worker-led, it's totally unincorporated. There's no legal form, it's not a nonprofit, it has no entity to speak of. It's really just a loose network of people who know each other on purpose. A good number of them, about 500, are in the Bay Area, and a good number of them are also freelancers and gig workers in their own way. Drivers for Lyft and Uber, people who are cleaning homes. Security guard, actually, who came to this event, he's a sort of temp security guard, but he works in tech, and he's also part of this really large and loose network. But what's important about this is this network has reinforced for a lot of people that being a gig worker in the tech industry has a much larger and much more difficult context to reckon with. We talk about Uber or whatever as being ruinous for transportation, but there's also people being made to work on things like Customs and Border Patrol, or immigration, what's the ICE acronym, I forget, Immigration and Customs Enforcement in the US. Some of these companies have loads of workers who are kind of in between this awkward place of being a freelancer, or finding some tiny small job, or working for Salesforce, or Amazon, or Microsoft, that are all building large-scale, complicated technology to reinforce the deportation machine, effectively, at least in the US, and I know that they've partnered with other European Union countries as well. So reminding ourselves that as tech workers who might have a sort of precarious position in the tech industry, there's a larger context of it's not like what you're doing with whatever tools you have is clean or just uncomplicated. There's always this larger context, and as much as we can remind ourselves, at least for the purposes of this session, that these companies are all complicit in bigger crimes of capitalism and racism, it helps, you know, reinforce the smaller adjustments we can make to help people get better income streams or flexibility in their work and so on. It's really, you know, balancing out people who would otherwise be stuck in these jobs and having to protest against drone programs so that they're being forced to work on. Giving them other options is you know, a nice sort of silver lining, I suppose, to this sort of session.
Great. I think that's a great way to end up.
So I put these points up if you wanted to screenshot this too, in case there was things you wanted to capture.
Will there be a way for people to get presentation of it? Because you mentioned loads of resources there, and I'm sure people may want to look those up. They drop you something on Twitter, or what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter or email. Sorry.
Email. Okay. Right.
And I will just point out the. You can even get these slides if you like. Sorry. You know what? Screw it. Just find me on email, and I'll send you the slides and all.
Thank you. That's great. So next we're going to hear a bit more about, do you know what, I'm not going to introduce you. We'll keep it simple. We'll keep it simple. You're providing loads of expert support yesterday around co-ops, and you've got tons of experience in this area. So we'll hear a bit more. Sorry, I don't know if you're up too much. But let's talk a bit about that from a gig work point of view. Where are you positioned on this, and what's going on around us?
I've been involved in co-op development since 1974. I spent about half of that time I started in co-op development in 1974. I spent about half my time in worker co-ops. I've had a few breaks in between. One of the first things I worked on is taxi co-ops, and in preparing now the research for the Working Together report. I hope some of you at least have downloaded it. If you haven't read it all, it's available from the address that will come right at the end of the presentation. Apps and technology, high technology, is only the latest thing to come to the taxi business, and some of the changes that take place in the taxi business have been transformational. The business model has changed completely, and I think we're now in a position that taxi firms that don't get involved in platforms will simply disappear. There's an old saying that if you don't learn the lessons of history, history will repeat itself. First as comedy and then as tragedy, and I think that's very much the case here. So the first thing I wanted to look at was going right back to 1875. Captain Armstrong, editor of the Globe newspaper, couldn't get a cab one night. He was the sort of man that sent out his man to go and look for a taxi for him, and his man couldn't find them and eventually found them in the pub, and they weren't really capable of actually driving him anywhere. So he set up this idea of setting up the green huts. The green huts obviously are teetotal. It's bacon sandwiches and cups of tea. There were 61 huts at its peak in 1914, and there's 13 that remain. Still run by a charity, still very much frequented by taxi drivers, although the law has changed now, and actually you can go in and you can have a cup of tea in there yourself if you want. They're all grade 2 listed. One of the key things this did was it got taxi drivers to start talking to each other.
Can I just say that's the best fact I've heard so far?
Okay, maybe there'll be a couple more yet. So, two-way radio was the next thing that really started to come along and change things. The first installation, this one here, is 1932. It doesn't look terribly practical. Two-channel and caller ID came a bit later on, but of course in the early days you had to do the old over and out stuff because you only had one channel. Cab drivers, when they logged on, would start off with a radio message into a call handler, a dispatcher, who would sit in an office somewhere and say, "It's Fred here, I'm in so-and-so street and I'm available for hire." And the dispatcher, which was usually a lady, would have to have a big map on the wall lots of little numbered pins or named pins, you know, Fred and John or whatever, and they would keep on radioing in at the end of every journey and say where they were. The other thing, of course, that really started to make this take off was the telephone. Of course, in those days it was the landline telephone, and that meant that people could then call into that dispatcher fairly easily. They didn't have to go to a call box and book a taxi. Now that was completely transformational, because up until that point they really had been in the gig economy. And just a reminder of the word gig, it is a two-seater horse-drawn carriage, and that's where the term came from, and that's what the original taxis were until they were modified, because most people who took taxis were a bit posher than us, and they didn't want to sit with the driver, so the taxi cab was modified so the driver sat up front by himself. Now that was completely transformational, because taxi drivers up to that point had been completely independent. All they had to do was roam the streets or sit on a rank and wait for a customer, and suddenly they had to join into a network. So this is when the first taxi co-ops actually started to take off. And of course also the private sector came in and set up lots and lots of privately controlled networks. And then came GPS. So you started to get the early GPS that was installed together with the radio link into the cab, so that instead of having to have that big map and the pins, the dispatcher could then actually look up and see where they were on a screen, and there's a button built into the system so the driver could put themselves as available for hire or already booked. So they could look on the map and see exactly who was where. Then of course you had
So when did regulation come in? You know, the licensing of cabs?
the licensing of cabs, I'm not sure. I think it was just after the First World War.
Okay.
Until that point they were
And the knowledge
unlicensed.
is all
And that's when the knowledge, well, the knowledge is only in London, of course.
Okay.
And always a matter of dispute in the other big cities. The dispatcher could then do it, and of course what we then got was computerized routing that was built into these systems, so that the dispatcher didn't have to decide who was the best placed driver on the screen. The thing would flag up. And then of course we've got telephone ID that comes in as well, and a lot of them run a database, or they buy in the post office database of everyone's telephone number and where you actually live, so they know instantly when you ring in on a landline exactly where you are. The next really big transformation then of course is apps. The smartphone apps, which dominated here in the UK by Uber, and that in many ways is the end of the dispatcher. So that job is over, because it's the computerized system behind the app that does all of the dispatching. It also effectively removes the restrictions that came in with licensing on what is a licensed hackney carriage and what is a private hire vehicle, because you can effectively call up and hail a cab that isn't a cab, because it might be just there across the street. You press the app, you walk over to the driver and you get in. That is just the same as if you raised your hand and the taxi drivers come to you. So it put a huge competitive advantage to the mini cabs. Now of course taxi co-ops are going to have these apps too. It's interesting that in Edinburgh the taxi market is completely dominated by co-ops. I have to say I didn't discover that until after I'd been to Edinburgh and jumped in a couple of cabs. So we've got City Cabs, which was established in 1925, before radio came in, and Central Taxis, which was established in 1971. City's got 400 members and 1,100 drivers. Central has 400 members and 1,300 drivers. So it's complete domination. It's about 85% of the market. Now, different cities have different regulatory systems. It's pretty strict here in London. But in London, the taxi licenses for the vehicles are not transferable. So the vehicle is issued, the license is issued to a person, and that license they then can only just give up. So when they come to retirement, they just give the license up. Edinburgh follows the same model that they have in Paris, and they're transferable. So when a taxi driver wants to retire, they can flog their license to another taxi driver. That controls the number of licenses, keeps it very strict, so the taxi drivers are quite happy. But it means any taxi driver coming into the system needs a loan just to get a license.
And these are platforms. They are not.
They both operate in the traditional way with telephones, but they both got apps. And
Can I ask a question specific to this thing? That's head allowed. What are they doing in Edinburgh, like at municipal level? What are they doing that enables them to do this in Edinburgh? What are they doing differently to keep Uber out and to keep corporate?
They're failing to keep Uber out. They completely
It's
dominate.
dominated by co-ops, like.
The traditional taxi trade is dominated by co-ops. They have to say they're both very efficient, they're reasonably priced, but because Uber is there, it's very difficult to stop Uber. Because all Uber applies for is not a taxi, a registered hackney license. It just goes for a private hire vehicle license, which is always a lower standard. And then it operates very much in the same way as a taxi because of the simplicity of the app. They both got apps. They both actually bought the apps, or they hire the apps from Cordic. So they've both gone for the same behind-the-scenes app developer. The apps are branded up and they're specific to each of those taxis. Looking abroad, you get similar things. The Green Taxi Co-op in Denver is a fully unionised co-op, done with the help of the unions in its startup. Founded after Uber had really got a grip on the market. And it was a fight back from the drivers to try and get better terms and conditions. It's got 800 drivers from 37 different nationalities, and it has a market share of 37%. So for a startup that hasn't been going that many years, it's got quite a good grip. They've actually developed their own app, but the Green Taxi Co-op app is based on the AutoCab. So what's holding taxi drivers back? That's my question. Why, in the fight against Uber, have they not actually got to gain a bit more? And I think some of the reasons, because taxi drivers talk to each other, and that was the key point about the green huts, and they sometimes talk to their fares. Many taxi drivers are unionised, and it's one of the few places where the big unions, Unite and the GMB, have actually managed to get self-employed people into membership and give them some sort of service. And the main service that they give them is negotiating the rates, the mileage rates and the standby rates that go into the taxi meters with each local authority, and also negotiating on the price of a license. But the key question that strikes me is, why aren't they all using the common app? The great advantage of Uber, people who use it tell me, I've never downloaded Uber and I won't, but the great advantage of Uber is you get off a plane in Egypt, you press your Uber app and you get a taxi. You know, it's the universality. So here we've got two co-ops that dominate the market in Edinburgh, both using the same app, but they're not sharing it. So somehow or other, we've got to get a way of getting a common platform worldwide. Now, some of the reasons, what we put together in the Working Together report, is we've made some recommendations, we've done lots of interesting, I hope, research, but we put together 8 innovations that we need to think about very carefully. Some of them apply to taxis, some of them are very specific to taxis. So union co-ops, one of the things we saw with green taxis is the support that they got from the trade union. The very simplest support that they got, first of all, was a free desk, a free office and a free phone line, and they said just come, use it and try and get the whole thing to set up. So that simple thing, cost the union absolutely nothing, the space was spare, but they could get that. And one of the beauties about union co-ops for a trade unionist, and they don't seem to have caught onto this, is it almost creates or recreates the union closed shop. Because if you make union membership a condition of membership in the co-op, then the co-op becomes 100% unionised. That's illegal in the employment situations in the UK, but perfectly legal if you do it this way. There's also the big issue, and I think that's one of the main things that holds them back in the taxi campaigns, and that's capital. The real reason that Uber is so successful is its use of vulture capitalists, as I call them, venture capitalists, to produce this huge amount of money, which isn't spent very much on the technology, it's spent on the promotion. The promotional budget is absolutely enormous to get it to roll out. And one of the problems we have with co-ops, worker co-ops in particular, because workers, when they come together to form a co-op, don't generally have a fortune behind them, is how do you raise enough capital to go through that period of 3 or 4 years of losses in order to set up something like a big platform. And that again is where cooperative capital in various forms could come in. In the UK, we're very, very sort of precious about worker co-ops, and we only allow effectively 100% worker ownership. On the continent, France, I know well, anything, as long as it's 51% worker owned, it's regarded as a worker co-op, so you can pull in other money from outside in the form of investment. You've also got government funds in France that will produce extra money for startups. So funding is really important. A cooperative capital, a genuine cooperative bank, which we don't have in the UK, mutual guarantee societies which enable people to borrow a lot more money, and also tapping into the money that the trade unions have got, that they have sitting in all sorts of odd places as investment. So all of those things I think are really crucial and things that we can learn from this. So I just want to sum up then by suggesting, for those of you who haven't got it, download the Working Together report. You can Google it or you can use this. It's placed up on the web in a number of places. I put this one up because it's the shortest URL. Question at the back there?
Yeah, at the bottom of that last slide, there was a thing there about the municipal commons platform. Could you explain that, please?
Municipal commons is the idea that essentially there's little difference between municipal ownership and the commons ownership. There's definitely a difference in the governance, but there is a sense in which municipalities, particularly smaller municipalities that are closer to people, I mean in France they even call municipalities communes still, so there is the fact that municipal ownership is not that different, and some of the common platforms that would be appropriate, for instance free Wi-Fi, for instance tourism resorts so that people could book Airbnb type bookings that could then be owned by a local authority, which is of course controlled through a democratic election system, and that is one way in which you could start to get commons platforms out there without the need for huge amounts of resources, because the municipalities have got those resources. So that's been identified as one of the ways in which local authorities can get in there and do things, and that also reminds me about the stuff that municipalities can do, and that was one of our recommendations. You know, that municipalities, local authorities can really get involved in legislation. So there's been legislation done in the States to enable bargaining rights for Uber drivers in certain cities, and of course here in London we've had the attempt, not quite successful but worked for a while, to de-restrict Uber and get their license taken away because they're not a fit company.
Right, can we just pause because we're going to run a little short
Move on,
time.
yeah.
So say thank you to Alex for that. That was a fantastic presentation. So we're going to hear about one of my favourite networks going, Smart, and this has been established for a while in Europe. So could you just tell us a little bit more about that, and then we'll hear the presentation.
So I'll be talking about Smart as a whole. I know there's a lot of people who are very interested with the things that we've done for Deliveroo lately, and so I can maybe answer questions on that afterwards. But I think there's also a lot of people in the room that don't necessarily know who we are and how we operate, and so it's more an introduction about what we are doing and how the model emerged. So my name is Lieza, I'm from Brussels. I work for Smart since 6 years now. Smart is a cooperative. It's a social enterprise that has been operating for 20 years now. And we managed to scale our business model through the development of a platform. And so that's why the platform co-op movement is interested in the way we operate, because without the platform we would be like a lot of other non-profits that would do very interesting work but would have remained very small scaled. So what we are doing basically is thinking about freelancing. When we started with artists, and the idea was very simple. It was artists had a lot of difficult time to actually get their stuff invoiced and work legally, because they are facing a very complex legal and administrational field. So they needed to set up a company, they needed to learn how to invoice, learn what taxation was about, take an accountant, and even if they did all of that, they quickly realized that it was actually difficult to legalize their activities, because they have roller coaster revenues. So they will have moments where they will earn a lot, and then they will have a lot of problems during the upcoming months because their revenues go down, and they still need to pay taxations. And so that pushes that whole community outside legal work. And SMART was trying to tackle that because the bigger aim of SMART is to say, how do you reconnect those specific people to social security? And that was the whole idea when SMART was set up. And so it was set up like a little non-profit in the cultural sector. And our baseline was to say we will take over the administrational burden that is linked to creative entrepreneurship. The thing that happened is after 2 years, the administrational burden that we took over from the artists, we actually put it upon ourselves. And it started getting really difficult to manage all that paperwork. And so there was a little bit of a question of maybe we should shut down because we cannot scale it, and it's just we're drowning in paperwork, and it's not really a sustainable way of operating. But the city of Brussels saw that we were doing something interesting, because suddenly that artistic community that was a little bit flying under the radar suddenly became part as a whole of society, and they said, you should not stop. What we can offer to you guys is actually help you with 2 employments, administrational support for the upcoming 2 years. That was around the years of 2000. And the founders of SMART said, that's great, but if 2 years is going to pass very quickly, and we do not want to be dependent on the subsidized business model, because that means that if our subsidized get cut in 2 years, we'll have the same problem as we are facing now. And so they invested during those 2 years very heavily on a digital platform that is actually digitalizing the whole administrational process that is linked to having a company. And so that's what we did. And the way we are operating is fairly simple. What we are doing is we created a company, and we allowed people to use it as if it was their own. As we are a co-op, it actually is their own company, because after 3 times invoicing with the SMART model, you become a stakeholder of the co-op. So we basically operate like a car sharing company, but what we share is a company. And so people can log on the platform, and on the platform they will be able to invoice. They will be able to make up their contracts. So it's a trust-based system. Every time somebody's working with us, they become our employee the time of their mission. And we will become their legal employer and make sure that they have insurance, make sure that they are plugged in with the different social security, taxes, and stuff like that. When we set up this system, we realized that a lot of our artists were slashers. And so they were doing a little bit of communication, they were doing a little bit of production. And so they were not only working as musicians or painters. And so we decided that as we were trying to simplify things, that we would take on those different gigs as well. And so little by little we opened up our services, and we suddenly realized that we had built a tool that was answering the questions of a lot of freelancers. And so we decided to open up our services to all freelancers. And so now we're 20 years later, and we have 50% of our revenue that still comes from the broad artistic sector. And we have 50% of our revenues that is coming from the service sector. We are a co-op, so we have a sustainable business model. We do not have, we are not subsidized. We do have a little bit of subsidies, but it's for very small parts of our activities. And so it represents something like 1% of our annual revenues. The rest is self-generated by the community, because the community accepts to pay 6.5% to a mutualized fund every time that they invoice through our company. That 6.5% is covering our operational costs. And the second thing it covers is a full range of mutualized services that are designed to secure the careers of freelancers.
6.5% of what?
Of what they invoice. So every time somebody's logging on the platform, makes up an invoice, we will take 6.5% in Belgium and 8.5% in the other upcoming countries. So if you look that up online, you will see that there's a mismatch. But in Belgium, it's 6.5%. And all that money is reinvested inside the local communities. And so the first thing that we did, what was really important, was securing administration. And so what we do is we become the employer. We do all the tax declarations. We make sure that everybody has insurance. And on top of that, we make sure that every one of our members has an individual advisor that he can call if he doesn't understand something about the platform, something about his contract. If he wants advice on his career, he can also go and see that advisor. If he needs legal advice, he can go and ask him. And we have a full team of people who are actually specialized in the different fields we are operating in. So we really try to create a sustainable network of freelancers. The second thing that we try to secure is financing. There's a lot of freelancers who have roller coaster revenues and who have troubles getting paid by their clients. And so the way we tackled that was by saying, okay, if you work through Smart, you have the guarantee that you will be paid within 7 days after the end of your gig, because we will constitute a salary guarantee fund. And so we have a mutualized fund amongst our freelancers that gives them the guarantee that they will be paid of their salary within 7 days at the end of their gig. We also do microfinancing, because there's a lot of people who need to upscale their material to actually get access to new clientele, or because it's outdated, especially all people working with IT, they need to renew all their stuff quite quickly. And so for us, it's much quicker and easier to give a loan to one of our members on small amounts, because we can see how they operate and we can see where it benefits their actual business. And so it's there again a lot of a trust-based way of operating, because the people we work with, we actually know them, and so it's more about the people than it actually is about the money in much of those cases. The other things that we do is we also invest on upskilling freelancers, because we know that they can have a lot of difficulties in certain areas of their field, and that they will probably have different forms of careers during the lifetime that they are actually working. And so we set up a full range of information sessions, networking events, peer-to-peer sessions, training sessions, to make sure that if they are in need for information, that we can actually in some way provide that information to them. We operate through a platform, but we are very much a physical company. We operate in all the territories where we are active. We have local offices, we have people working on the field, we try to connect people one with another, and the platform is only there to get rid of the stuff nobody wants to do, which is the paperwork. We also invest on our development, because our bigger aim is to reinvent social security for the gig economy, for freelancers, for all workers, regardless of where they are at. And so Belgium is a little bit too small to do that on its own. And now currently we're operating in 9 European countries. And we're going heavily on that, because we believe that on a European level we could be actually get some leverage on that. We are also investing on creative hubs, because it's good to rethink how you organize work, but how do you physically do that? And so we're investing in creative hubs, because, and not co-working spaces, and there's a clear distinction between the two of those. We create communities where people can go and work, and where they will meet other freelancers working in other fields that can actually enhance their individual experience of being a freelancer. So it's basically the same idea as what we're doing with our tools, our digital tools, but in the physical space. It's just saying every freelancer needs to find an office, equip it with internet. If they're a little bit old school, they need to equip it with phone as well. And they need to pay their electricity bills, get insurance, and so it gets a whole it gets very complicated for a very poor result, because they will find themselves isolated in a little office somewhere in the city without connection to their peers. And so the idea of creative hubs is really to create big spaces where you mutualize the costs of the physical space, the internet connection, the electricity, and everything you need to be fully operating. And then we just put a bunch of people together. They get a lower rate than the marketplace, so we managed to attract quite a lot of people. And our intention is to keep them with us on a long period of time, at least 2-3 years. That's something that's healthy, because it's the time that is needed to actually construct relationships between people. So we do not enforce that, but by the fact of sharing a space and meeting up continuously and investing that space as if it was your own, because we do not do desk hopping. Everybody has his own space that he can furbish the way he wants, and they can get involved in the events and the programations of the events that we organize as well. But that's a whole chapter. I can spend an hour on that. I managed 2 of those hubs with one of my good colleagues, so that could be a subject on their own.
It's fantastic because it's
And
just
the
such an established network. Yes, go on.
Yeah, the last one that we do is that the last project that we launched in Belgium is long-term contracts, again, for freelancers who actually work on a regular basis and been working with us for a while, and that actually have the ability to offer themselves a long-term contract. We reintroduced that, and so they have easier access to loans and to housing opportunities and stuff like that. And if you have questions, my email is there, so you can just drop me an email on whatever subject you're interested in.
Thank you. We give her a round of applause. Thank you very much.
What I always say is that when you open up a shop, you will have shoplifters, but that doesn't mean that you will not open up the shop.
Sure.
So we do on the fringes of, everybody's always interested on everything that happens on the fringes. The legal case is on the fringes of our way of operating. People who abuse the trust of the platform, they can actually do it. But we managed to scale that much that we can actually absorb those problems. And when you identify a problem within your company, you put in a few processes to make sure that there's a guard somewhere that detects it easier the second time it happens. So it does happen, but it's very anecdotal in our way of operating. The thing where we, which is more important, is, for example, companies that go bankrupt, and that are the clients of our members. And so if there's a bankruptcy, that means that we lose that money as well. And we took the decision, if a company legally goes bankrupt, to cover that for our freelancers, because we as a collective organization can absorb that risk of bankruptcy, whereas the individual, it has too much of a social impact on that one person. And so that's a bigger chunk, but it's still on the fringes of what we're doing. And it's like when Take It Easy, one of the gig economy platforms, went bankrupt in Belgium. That meant that 360,000 euros of salaries were not able to be paid out. We picked up that tab and we paid all the freelancers. And it did hurt a little bit, because you always want everything to go smoothly. But it was less dramatic for us as a big organization than it would be for the individual freelancer not being paid of the 400, 500 euros that he was supposed to have to pay his rent that day.
It's a brilliant example, and it obviously increases trust in Smart. I'm going to say gentleman back in the blue shirt, and then second row, and then over to the front.
So something, this is a question for all of you. Something that's been referred to, but I wonder if you could bring it center stage, which is the role, like what are the lessons from your experiences in terms of the role of the enabling state, particularly at the municipal level? Like what are the critical interventions where an enabling state can help support what you're doing?
In Smart's case or in general?
So, like in general, it's a question from yesterday's, are the commons going to completely replace the state? But you correctly said they're not. But actually the state can play, whether at the national level or at the municipal level, can be a critical leverage point for actually supporting kind of work. So, like either case studies or just really good examples of how local government or really government at any level can open up a space in which this kind of activity can flourish.
Well, the local government of Brussels gave us a grant a little bit less than a year ago to look into ways to make the platform co-op movement grow in Brussels and to see with the existing actors of the field how we can grow that ecosystem and make sure that the narrative around ethical digital entrepreneurship can emerge. And so I think governments and municipalities have a role to play when they detect interesting initiatives. The city of Brussels helped Smart in the first 2 years of operating, and Smart was smart enough to actually, sorry about that, was smart enough to actually make a good use of that breathing time they had over the 2 years. So I think there's a need for creating those connections and to enhance those connections, and we need to be better at selling what we're doing and communicating what we're doing. In Smart's case, in Belgium, it's a little bit easier, and not always, but it's just that we have more leverage in a debate because we managed to scale. And now we're trying to actually what we're trying to do currently is to apply what we always say to our members, which is don't work alone, make sure that you have a resilient network. We're trying to apply that to our own legal structure as well, and identify the good partners and get leverage through the fact that we're saying, hey, we're all of those organizations representing all of those peoples. And so that managed to help the discourse with local municipalities happen. So I think municipalities need to get better, but we as organizations, we need to get better in communicating what we're doing as well.
Are there any experiences from, yeah.
I'll give you two examples. First one's from France, and it's in some ways negative. We've got the CAE system in France, the Co-ops of Activité and Entrepreneurship. In some ways, a pioneering model, a little bit older than Smart, and very similar in the way they work. But they work principally with taking people from unemployment into self-employment, and so are quite heavily subsidised by the state, by departments, by municipalities, and by European funds, and a little bit of private funds. Which has enabled them to get going and work in a more difficult area where people need a lot more support. But on the other hand, CAE, yeah. Again, it's in the working together report. Sorry.
I'm just going to start. Just read the report.
Yeah, just read the report.
Just read the report. It's great.
If you want promise to read the report, I'll shut up now.
Yeah.
So, but what it has done, of course, is has made them a bit more grant dependent, and they haven't grown with the same dynamism that Smart has done. Because Smart has taken that really strong co-op principle with independent organisations rather than social enterprises that were funding. A more positive one is from Wales, where 2 years ago, after a lot of negotiations, was a new health and social care bill that came into power, and that has a specific duty placed upon local authorities when commissioning social care to work and try and prioritise working with co-ops. So that has caused quite a big boom now of social co-ops being developed in Wales.
Is it in the report?
Don't think so.
Not in the report.
Let's read two things.
That sounds really interesting as well. So we take the last two questions together, and then I think those are our last ones.
Mine's more of an observation,
Right.
really. I'm at University College London, Senior Research Fellow in Strategy, Resilience and Security. We've got 30 years background in thinking of global exchanges and things like that. And I'm working on what I call institutions and instruments. And the institutions we think of as organisations, but there actually can be agreements. And what you said, Danny, about the association, with the, what was it you called it, coalition?
The Tech Workers Coalition.
That's it. Because I'm interested in global agreements, but they're agreements, and they're agreements to a common purpose. And they're agreements to share risk, they're agreements to share surplus, they're agreements to share data. We don't have these institutions in the agreements at the moment. I mean, I'm working on this enterprise governance on the one hand, but also I'm doing it at community level at the other, because resilience is bottom up. Now the point I'm getting to is, we have tools out there. We have, who here has heard of protection and indemnity club? Yeah? Well, there are certain risks that Lloyd's of London don't take for ships, right? Political risks. So the ship owners clubbed together 150 years ago, Protection and Indemnity Club, and mutually assured the ships. And they appointed a broker, a service provider, to manage the platform. They didn't call it that. It's multi-billion business, and it's mutual assurance of risk. We can take the same model and apply it to credit, to performance, and actually do it on a global scale. This is the potential. This is just one, mutual risk assurance. Oh, by the way, it's also a form of Islamic finance, but that's another issue. The second one, anybody here heard of machinery rings?
Yeah.
I knew you would, Alex. But Scottish farmers, I think they started and Welsh too. I think it started in the Scottish borders. They clubbed together to actually share machinery. Then they got onto contractors. Then they got onto fuel. So they compete on quality but cooperate on costs. And that is another, really, it's more of an association than it is an organisation. And I think when you start then bringing land into the issue, which is a completely different conversation, because what you guys are doing is dealing with people. If we can bring the people together, mutually assure the risk, mutually assure use of essentials like land and energy, and I think we're about that far away from it, because this is what I'm working on. With simple, common platforms, you would be the perfect service provider to a platform of a service user association. That's essentially what you are. Anyway, so it's just an observation coming from right now. It's an inspiring event, and that's why I'm here, just to hear more about what people are actually doing. Anyway, thank you.
That's
You're bearing with me.
Really helpful observation. And so you almost making an analogy of the machinery that's being shared to the opportunities and the platforms that we have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Machinery covers all sorts of
You know what I mean?
But
Yeah.
the cleaners who've got cleaning
Yeah.
equipment, they could easily share.
Similar to the olive
Yeah.
farmers approach and the co-ops.
But you're also approaching service provision. So
Yeah.
I'm talking in Russia, for instance, to let's provide the fuel
Yeah.
and the vehicles, but it's not selling cars.
Yeah.
It's
Doesn't have to
supplying
be
the
what you
use
do.
of the
Yeah.
car. So it's mobility as a service.
And are you researching this at the minute? Or
I'm doing it.
you're doing it?
Yeah.
Okay, brilliant.
Advising governments on it. But
Right.
not this government, because they haven't got a clue.
Which government?
This one. Ours.
You are advising this
No,
government?
no, no. They don't want to
No,
know.
so
They're
who are
idiots.
you advising?
They're
Just so we...
Well, Iran, Russia,
Right,
Greece.
interesting.
All the democratic ones.
We've got our last question, so thank you.
Did you say the small employees people, and if so, do they have an employment contract with you?
Yes.
Because one of the issues, I think, was it chemical plumbers, there was an employment case and around whether the platform should our employers and provide things like holidays and sick pay and things like that. So do you provide that?
Well, the thing is, all our freelancers become workers of our cooperative. So they all have an employment contract when they are working with us. The thing with the social security, the way it exists currently in Belgium, is that you need to pay a certain amount of taxes to actually be able to benefit from social security, which is not the case for precarious workers, because if you don't work enough, that means you pay taxes but you don't get the benefits of it. And so that's a real problem that we did not tackle yet. But every time somebody is working with us, we are his legal employer. And that's always also how we got involved with the Deliveroo case, is that they knew that they were precarious workers. They did not.
So people work for you for the duration of the contract?
Yes.
They negotiated themselves?
Yes.
Is that right? Okay.
Yes, we are not an
Okay.
intermediate between a client. People come to us when they already have a gig and they want to invoice it.
Yeah.
So we're just taking away the burden of creating an entity to actually be an entrepreneur or wannabe entrepreneur or one-shot entrepreneur or whatever you want to call it. We have people who will invoice a few times, who will come back 2 years later, who will do a full-time career, have a baby, stop completely, come again. And that's actually what a lot of new workers are seeking for. So that is our main category. And then we also have the precarious workers that work with us. because there's no risk involved with using smart. You use the company and then you pull out as soon as there is no work involved. The only thing that is a pity is that there's no real social security for people who don't earn enough money. But what's one just interesting number within the smart community is that we are enabled to provide all the services that we provide to 100% of our community, thanks to the invoicing of 20% of our community. So there's 80% of our community that does not invoice well enough to actually unlock all the services that we have been operating. But people are, one day they will be part of the 20% and then probably they will be part of the 80% and but there's no distinction in the way we treat those
So
numbers.
say in an employment contract, if somebody falls sick, then do they get sick pay, for example, or does that become below the threshold of the social security?
That they can, it depends on the countries. But it's, they need to have their mutual in Belgium, you need to have a mutual thing. We will sign the paperwork for those, for the mutuals, but it's the mutual that takes it in charge. We do not pay sick pay because that's not something that we're able to carry out. But that's a very technical question. I can get back to you with you have my email.
Yeah.
And if you really want to know in detail how that operates, I can take care of that next week.
Thank you.
I could just come
I was just going to say,
on
can we just, because people have only got 10 minutes, and then we can, anyone who wants to come and ask questions, come up to the front. And thank you everyone for sticking it out for the last bit of Q&A. So.